GAO has estimated that the federal government improper payments totaled $236 billion in fiscal year 2023. Since 2003, it's estimated that the cumulative improper payments total $2.7 trillion. And while we will never know the exact total of improper payments made, that in and of itself, that statement in and of itself is a sad one to make. We won't know the total funds lost to fraud during COVID. GAO estimates that it exceeded $500 billion. While congressional and agency attention to this longstanding problem has resulted in increased accountability, improper payments and outright fraud persist, particularly when policymakers, including congressional policymakers, prioritize shoveling money out the door in response to a crisis instead of ensuring those funds reach their intended recipients. Ms. Williams-Brown, thank you for your testimony and for GAO's attention to improper payments. We appreciate that. In a 2022 review of COVID-19 relief programs entitled Emergency Relief Funds, significant improvements are needed to ensure transparency and accountability for COVID-19 and beyond. A very pithy title to your report. GAO made a number of recommendations for Congress to consider in order to reduce fraud in federal emergency programs. I'm happy to announce that my office has drafted a bill. It's actually in GAO's hands now for review to implement some of those recommendations. One of those recommendations is that Congress enact a law effectively requiring federal agencies to adopt model internal control plans based on OMB guidance, which could be used in or adapted to a future emergency response. Can you please talk about the need for agencies to adopt emergency internal control plans and what steps those plans should include?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your support on this endeavor. So what we really want OMB to do in conjunction with the agencies is to really think about how they will handle emergency situations before they happen. Trying to figure out what those upfront controls are in the moment, it's not going to happen. The priority is going to be getting the money out the door. And many of the controls that need to be in place are controls that need to be in place for existing programs. So it's not that they necessarily need to do something special or different, but it's making sure that agencies are building those controls in up front, having a plan in place, so they're thinking about it. So it's similar to coming up with a contingency plan. You think about it ahead of time, so when you're faced with the emergency, you already have the muscle memory to know what you need to do in place. And this is what we want OMB to work with the agencies to do, because we think that's the best way to really achieve that goal of preventing those dollars from going out the door before they go out the door.
Appreciate that. Thank you. The widespread proliferation of sensitive personal identifiable information due to data breaches like the recent National Public Data Breach or the activities of the unregulated data broker industry is making it very easy for fraudsters to assume identities and steal government benefits using date of birth, social security number, or childhood address. Yet many methods of identity verification actually rely upon the data matching conducted by those same data brokers. Some recommendations to Congress mention data matching as a useful tool to prevent improper payments. But as Congress is working to strike a balance on preventing fraud and protecting consumer privacy, can you speak to the pros and cons of deploying it as a fraud prevention solution? Ms. Brown.
Identity verification is critically important. It is a complicated issue, but it's one that has to happen. I think Mr. Horowitz may be able to speak to it, but I think identity theft was a huge issue during the pandemic, as well as synthetic identities. That's a new complicating factor that makes it even more complicated to identify the fraud. So there was a perfect storm brewing as the pandemic hit, and the fraudsters were really ready to pounce because there was lots of readily available, personally identifiable information available on the dark web for them to exploit.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Horowitz, this next three questions, I'm putting them into one compound question before I run out of time, because he'll let you run on and answer questions, but he's not going to let me run on too long. So here's my three questions for you. Last time you were here, I flagged that early implementation of ID verification technology in Arizona based on NIST digital identity guidelines is credited with preventing more than $75 billion in unemployment insurance fraud. There was 99% reduction in fraud in Arizona using that. What has prevented more states from implementing similar measures? How can Congress encourage states to consider identity verification technology or other anti-fraud tools more broadly? Now, while you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask the other question real quick, too. We wrote to you on August 22nd, 2023 about the IRS whistleblower cases and specifically the scope of your investigation of their claims of retaliation. Can you, today before you leave, can you provide us an update about their cases and maybe tell us a bit about the scope of your inquiry and when we can expect a resolution? So two very different topics, but I tried to get those in before my time was too far expired.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
On the first issue, I think, as we've talked about during the hearing, we have, every state has its own workforce agency. They're at varying levels of sophistication on technology. Some of them have very old technology. Some of them have newer technology that makes it, frankly, a lot easier to implement some of the verification tools that you and I have talked about in the past. And so I think probably first and foremost, that's the overlying issue, which is I think it's very important for us to get a baseline understanding of where the states are, not to point fingers and wag fingers at people, but you can't know the scope of the problem unless you understand what they can and can't do. And I think that's very important up front.
And so how do you get that?
Well, I think what Congress needs to do, and we're happy to come and speak with you about this, is put together an effort with the Labor Department and the state workforce agencies, which, by the way, we worked with closely on pandemic-related issues, and understand how we can figure that out and how we can understand best what they need, and also what kind of identity verification tools will work for them and can work for them. We've been seeing this at the federal level and trying to understand, and we've seen varying programs be out there, including facial recognition software, others, on how to identify individuals, and there are challenges. When a pandemic hits, for example, people couldn't walk into the agency, right? They were closed. So how do you do that from a distance? Not everybody has, as we saw, broadband or internet access. And so people in rural areas, we saw, weren't able to timely apply for some of these programs and got shut out from some of them because they didn't have access to that kind of software. Individuals who were elderly who didn't have internet access or didn't know how to best pursue that. So it's a complicated area, but I think the first thing that's missing is what you and I have talked about, what you mentioned, which is understanding what the state workforce agencies can and can't do in the first instance, because it is widely varying out there. On the second issue, as we've talked about before on this, when there's an ongoing criminal case, we put on hold some of our work. We have met with the whistleblowers in the past. We continue to have that matter on our list of items, but we follow our usual course. We hit a pause while a criminal case is going on. That may be winding down, and that will allow us to consider where we go from there. So, I'm reminded OSC has jurisdiction on this, and I know they have a matter. The Office of Special Counsel, the agency, not the Justice Department Office of Special Counsel. Now we're talking about a separate agency for the public's purpose. I know you know that. And so they have the look at the retaliation. What we have is the management-related issues that I have authority over as the Justice Department Inspector General. So we're trying to keep those lanes, as we always do, by the way, separate.
So the DOJ, are you able to pursue and investigate now the management side, which is the DOJ side?
If and when the criminal case gets completely resolved, which is, it's not completely resolved yet, we can then re-engage on that. And I'm happy to talk with you further about that, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for indulging me. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. I'm going to ask one more